welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me again on Roadside History. Today I'm in a remote part of the United States. I'm taking you to one of the most historical places in United States history. Not because of some great war or battle or historical document that was signed, but I'm taking you to a place that made westward migration and travel possible, and it made it fast. Today I'm taking you to the Golden Spike Historical National Monument, which is in northern Utah. It's a place where the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads would eventually meet. They would meet at Promontory Summit, where a golden spike would be driven into the ground, ceremoniously uniting the two railroad companies and their track that they laid all the way across the United States. Today I'm going to take you to the actual place, to Promontory Summit. I'm going to give you a little background and history on both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. I'm going to tell you why this was significant and also what it did for the United States as a country. Thanks again for joining us, and if you haven't already liked and subscribed to my channel, please do so. As the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific rail companies competed to draw track and draw the most track and meet in Promontory Summit, they had faced many obstacles. One of the obstacles is standing behind me. It's known as the Big Fill. The Central Pacific Railroad Company, backed by Eastern money and a slew of Mormon volunteers here in northern Utah, got together, and for about 2 months they filled about 10,000 cubic yards of dirt. This area behind me, straight in front of you, you can see between the hillside over here and the hillside over here, that area is known as the Big Fill. And the Big Fill would be an area that was just a valley where they would bring a tremendous amount of dirt and drop the dirt in the area so that they could lay track all the way across there so that they can meet in Promontory Summit. Again, you have to understand that when the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific were competing, they were competing for massive amounts of money from the federal government as to who could complete the train line the soonest. It's here at Promontory Summit, Utah, where the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific rail lines met in May of 1869, joining the country together by rail. In 1804, Lewis and Clark set out to find the Northwest Passage, the great waterway that would lead people from the east to the west, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, that great waterway never existed. And for years and years and years, Americans would dream of being able to get from the East Coast to the West Coast quickly, in a timely manner, and also to open up markets and bring goods and people and services from one end of the country to another. Well, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln had that vision. As railway travel had begun increasing over the years, Abraham Lincoln signed the Railroad Act of 1862, which set parameters on how the railroad would be laid in terms of the size of track, the width of track, as well as where the starting and end points would be, as well as massive subsidies by the federal government to the companies that could get this done. The two companies that emerged were the Central Pacific, which was based out of Sacramento, California, and the president of that was a man by the name of Leland Stanford, and the Union Pacific. And the Union Pacific was going to be based out of Omaha. They would begin building track westward. Both companies had a tremendous undertaking. You can imagine this is over 1,000 miles of track where ground had to be graded, it had to be leveled. Of course, trains can't operate in steep inclines, so 1 to 2% incline, so surveyors had to be involved. It was a tremendous undertaking, and you also have to consider the amount of area that they're covering. They have to have supply lines. They have to have lumber. Of course, in the Great Plains, that's an issue. There's not much lumber. But of course, coming out of the west, out of California, there's a tremendous amount of lumber because of the Sierra Nevadas. In addition to that, they both faced other challenges. Finding labor. For example, coming out of the east, out of Omaha, you have to understand in 1862 when the act was passed, and then in 1863 when construction began, the Civil War was still going on. So finding people to work, hired labor, was difficult to do. The Union Pacific would hire a number of Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, and some Native Americans. And they would grow as time would go on. And when the Civil War came to an end, they were able to employ more people. But again, behind me, the Central Pacific, they would hire more Chinese labor. And the Chinese labor turned out to be excellent. They worked very, very hard and did a tremendous job for this company. But building track was difficult. The Central Pacific at sometimes moved as slow as 8 inches a day, trying to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, and the Union Pacific would move as much as a mile a day because they were dealing with the Great Plains and they didn't have quite as many obstacles, although they still faced challenges. As these two companies were laying track, they were simultaneously laying a transcontinental communication systems together. What they were doing was laying line for the telegraph. The telegraph would be hung all the way across the United States, telegraph cable, so that communication could maintain itself and be ongoing throughout the building process, which was great because the country was able to follow the developments of the Transcontinental Railroad. They were able to see the massive progress that was taking place, as well as the shortcomings in progress. But it was a tremendous undertaking, which was done well ahead of schedule, which opened up so much expansion into the western United States. Obviously, with the completion of the railroad, what used to take 6 months traveling by horse and buggy now took about a week. And with that, people began to flood into the western half of the United States. And with that became a lot of things. Obviously, we saw almost the extinction of the buffalo. We saw the end of the Plains Indian Wars. We also saw the massive influx of people, the growing of larger communities and cities. People had already been out west before the railroad, but the railroad made it possible to move people and goods at a faster way. And of course, when you can move people and goods in a faster way, cost goes down, especially for goods. It gets products to market faster, such as the case, for example, of the buffalo. When the buffalo were being slaughtered on the plains and their bodies were being left to waste and rot, their furs were being shipped and their skins were being shipped across country for whatever they needed to be made for, whether it be hats, whether it be floors, whether it be jackets, just being sent everywhere, and they were able to get them to market faster. So the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as, and you can't take this for granted, but as well as the communications from the telegraph, really opened up the western United States. Of course, newspapers were able to produce things quicker and get stories back to the people in the eastern half of this country. As you can imagine, the Union Pacific Railroad faced many challenges. The race was on because there was a tremendous amount of money involved here. But by 1867, that movement had been slow from 1863 on to 1867. But by 1867, the Union Pacific Railroad had reached Cheyenne, Wyoming. And at this point, they were laying about a mile of track a day. But the working conditions were not ideal. Indian raids were taking the lives of several of their workers. The working conditions were taking the lives of workers, as well as the harsh winters that they had to endure. You started to see rail towns basically follow the railroad workers. And in these rail towns, these small communities that were short-lived, there was a tremendous amount of crime, a tremendous amount of drinking, death, and whatnot that was going on because of the way of life that these people were living. They're trying to work while at the same time they're kind of living it up, if you will, and made for some difficult times. On the flip side, as I turn my attention now to the Central Pacific's train, they faced similar working conditions, not as many Indian raids because they weren't on the plains. And they were building far fewer amounts of track each year. In fact, at one point, they were blasting through a tunnel. The Summit Tunnel, which is located in the Sierra Nevada mountains, is about a little over 1,600 feet long. And by 1866, the Central Pacific was laying about 39 miles of track a year, which wasn't a ton, but again, keep in mind, they had to go through the granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1868, they were laying 350 miles of track a year. And as they got closer, as the two rail companies got closer and closer, the push and the race was on. Both companies were trying to get to Ogden, Utah, because if they could get to Ogden, Utah, then they could control the trade of the Salt Lake Valley, which was a tremendous amount of trade, which would bring a lot of wealth to these companies as well. Keep in mind, to put product on trains costs money. To ship product costs money. So the railroads that can control these type of things will make more money. And that was part of the race between these two rail lines. They couldn't come to an agreement as to where the two lines should sync up. And eventually by April, they did come to an agreement, and they agreed to meet here at Promontory Summit, Utah. And both companies began to speedily work through things and lay track. In fact, at one point, I believe the Central Pacific laid 10 miles of track in one day, which was unheard of at the time. But what a tremendous undertaking to open up the Western United States. The vision that President Lincoln and others had to create a transcontinental rail system was incredible. And the amount of work and the undertaking that it would have taken to accomplish a task so big is quite incredible. Tremendous undertaking that opened up the Western United States, but probably more important that it's the effect that came from this. Of course, the Plains Indians and the wars would soon end. Unfortunately, the buffalo would become almost extinct. The telegraph line would allow for communication from New York to California in a matter of seconds. Newspapers were able to get news out to people. But anyway, I just want to thank you for coming along with me on a road trip today and learning a little bit more about Promontory Summit, Utah, the Golden Spike, where the two trains came together, as well as a little bit of the history of the area. Till next time, have a safe road trip. When you visit the Golden Spike National Monument, you'll see these two replica trains that represent the two trains that were there. The first one you're looking at is train number 119, which belonged to the Union Pacific Railroad, and their vice president, Dr. Thomas Durant, was there to attempt to hammer in one of the golden spikes. But on the other end, Leland Stanford, what you're looking at here is a replica of his own personal train car, the Jupiter. And Leland Stanford, who is also Stanford University is named after, was the individual that would hammer in the spike for the Central Pacific. Ironically enough, the spikes went directly in between these two trains where they stand today, and neither man was able to hit the spike when they hammered the nail.